This chapter is about data and the database administration, and there are two titles in the company. One is called Data Administrator and the other is called Database Administrator, DA and the DBA. And those people are the custodians of the important corporate resource, which is data and information. So their responsibilities are ensuring the accuracy, availability, security, and the performance of the database and the data warehouse in the company, because data is really important for both transactional processing and the decision making today in companies. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about the responsibilities of data administrators and the database administrators. And we are going to talk about some of the techniques data administrators and database administrators can use to ensure the security and availability of the databases. Some of the topics we are going to cover, including the definition of terms, what does it mean to be a data administrator and what does it mean to be a database administrator, some of the responsibilities of these two roles. We'll talk about data dictionaries, concurrency control, right, which is very important in the multi-user database environment. We'll talk about how to ensure data security and how to conduct the data recovery. Databases are becoming really important these days in companies, right? Because daily transactions and the decision making are both depending on databases and data warehouses. And also because a number of new regulations such as the Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, they are raising the requirements for companies' database accuracy, security, privacy, and so on. So the responsibilities of the DBAs and the DAs have really expanded over the years. A number of other trends are also expanding the responsibilities of these two groups of people. For example, databases are getting larger and larger. Right? A lot of the companies are using data warehouses these days, which is a very large repository of data. A lot of companies are getting into e-business. The database needs to be accessible through the internet these days, right? So that's adding more responsibilities and also security risks to the database and the data warehouses. Companies have realized the separation between the operational systems and informational systems. Because of that, you need to hire more DBAs to take care of these two different types of databases in the company. And the companies are more and more dependent on databases. Without the database, or if the database is not available, you cannot run a business anymore these days. So the availability, the security of the database are becoming very important issues for companies. So all of these trends are really expanding the responsibilities of these two groups of people, data administrators and the database administrators. This slide has the definitions of these two roles. The first role is data administration, and this is a high-level function that is responsible for the overall management of data resources in an organization, including maintaining corporate-wide definitions and standards. So as you can see, this definition does not really refer to any technical responsibilities. It's mainly a business responsibility. Right? The person who's in the position of data administrator is responsible for developing policies and standards for data resources. And this is a person who is responsible for leading the data modeling process for the company. So this person is not going to be very hands-on in managing the database. The person is not going to be a technical person. It's most likely to be a high-level business manager who understands the importance of data and information, the needs of the information and data in the company, as well as some of the technical issues. At least technical enough to be able to communicate with technical people. This person would kind of be like the controller of the company, except the controller of the company is in charge of the financial data and the financial information of the company, but this person is really in charge of the databases of the company, setting the policies and the standards. The other role, database administration, that's a technical function that's responsible for physical database design and for dealing with technical issues such as security enforcement, database performance, and the backup and the recovery. So this person, DBA, is very hands-on in managing databases. This person has technical skills and is in charge of the daily operations of the database and the database management systems. So that's the difference between these two roles. For data administration, the responsibilities are usually in planning and analysis phases of the database development process. While for database administrators, their responsibilities are usually in the logical database design and the physical database design phases. The main responsibility for data administrators is really data modeling, while the main responsibility for database administrator is really database design. And the data administrators are more concerned with metadata, while the database administrator is more concerned with the actual data, the physical data in the company. So let's take a look at some of the functions of data administration first. This slide lists some of the important functions of a data administrator. The data administrator is there to set the data policies, procedures, and the standards. For example, the person is going to set the password policies for accessing database. The person is going to determine the naming conventions for database elements, how to name the tables, how to name the fields, things like that. And the person is also going to determine the accessibility of certain data, which data is going to be highly guarded, and which data is going to be accessible to everybody. The second responsibility is database planning, which means the person needs to provide the leadership in developing information architecture for the company. The person needs to plan for the use of data and the databases for the company in the next few years. And the third responsibility is to resolve data conflicts. Because today a database does not belong to any functional areas anymore. A database belongs to the company. However, some functional areas still want to exert control over certain data. When there is a data conflict in the organization, the data administrator needs to be able to resolve it. So that's why a data administrator needs to be a high-level business manager who has influence and power in the company. Data administrator is also responsible for managing the information repository. And in the information repository, we have the metadata and the data dictionary. So the person is responsible for developing the information repository and maintaining the information repository. The person is in charge of the internal marketing of DA concepts. Okay, so what are some of the DA concepts? For example, the importance of data and information in decision making and daily transactions, improving the awareness of data security among the employees. So as you can see, this is really not a highly technical position. It's more of a managerial position. Now let's look at some of the traditional database administration functions. So as you can see from this list, all the responsibilities are very technical. Right? This person is very hands-on in managing databases in the company. For example, this person is going to be hands-on in selecting the database management systems and the software tools that's going to work with the company's other systems and also which is appropriate for the company's business functions. The person is in charge of installing these DBMS and also upgrading these DBMS, installing the patches for these DBMS on a regular basis. And also this person is responsible for tuning the database performance and also improving query processing performance. Well, these two responsibilities are the ones that are going to take up most of the DBA's time, because these two are ongoing responsibilities. The DBAs will spend a lot of time trying to tune the database performance to ensure that the database is performing at an optimal level. The DBA is constantly making changes to some of the queries to ensure that these queries will perform at optimal levels on the databases. So these are two of the most important responsibilities of the DBA. And DBA is also very hands-on in managing the data security, privacy, and integrity. Like making sure the database is accurate, secure, and does not reveal any private information. Usually in a company there is one key DA, data administrator, but there are usually quite a few DBAs. Another responsibility is data backup and recovery. Again, this is something DBA has to do on a daily basis, especially for data backup. These days, data backup is automated. But in case of a disaster, the data needs to be restored. DBA is in charge of restoring and recovering the database. So as you can see, these responsibilities are very, very technical. This slide shows some evolving approaches to data administration, some of the new trends in data administration. First, we are seeing that in a lot of the companies, they are blending data and the database administration into one role in order to simplify the data management process. And then the other thing we are seeing is companies are doing what's called a fast-track development, which means they are shortening the process of developing a database application. We are seeing a number of new roles emerging in certain companies. Like for example, there is a new role called a procedural DBA. And these people are in charge of writing triggers and stored procedures in the database. As we talked about in the previous lectures, triggers and the stored procedures are small programs that can be executed to perform certain database functions. And these are becoming commonplace in databases these days. And a lot of the activities can be automated using triggers and the stored procedures. So there is a need for people who are skilled in writing these procedures. Those DBAs are called procedural DBAs. We are also seeing the emergence of eDBAs, whose responsibility is to develop internet-based databases and applications. And we are also seeing the emergence of wireless DBAs, and those people are responsible for making the data accessible through smartphones or other wireless devices. And we are also seeing what's called the data warehouse administrators, and these people are in charge of data warehouses. Especially for data warehouse administration, that's becoming more and more important and more commonplace in companies. And that's because more and more companies are using data warehousing techniques for discovering information. And most of the database management systems today also come with data warehousing and data mining module. For example, SQL Server, Oracle, both of them have what's called a business intelligence module. So there is a increasing need for people who can perform these activities. As this slide shows, some of the responsibilities are kind of similar to the data administrators and the database administrator. However, the responsibilities of the data warehouse administrator usually emphasizes on integration and the coordination of metadata across many data sources, because you get the data for the data warehouse from multiple databases. One of the responsibilities for the DBA is to ensure the database security. Database security refers to the protection of the data against the accidental or intentional loss, destruction, or misuse. When it comes to data security, one thing you have to understand is that there is really no 100% security. It's not achievable. Now, you can put a lot of money in securing your database, and you still wouldn't be able to have 100% security. So for any company, you need to make a decision about how much accessibility you want to provide, and also how much security you want to provide, right? Because the more accessibility you provide, the less secure the data is going to be. And the less accessibility you provide to your users, then the more secure the data is going to be. You can lock the data in a vault and nobody can access it, then you're going to have very high security. But that's obviously not the right thing to do. So you need to find the sweet spot on this spectrum in terms of accessibility and security. And also because of the internet and e-commerce activities, there is an increased difficulty in securing databases these days. When you look at the database security, you cannot just focus on the database alone, because a database needs to be supported by a number of other technical elements. Like for example, the hardware, the software, the operating systems, the network, and so on. So when you look at database security, you really have to look at the whole picture. This picture shows you some of the possible locations of data security threats. For example, people can intercept your message, intercept the data that's being transmitted over the network. So in order to secure a database, you have to make sure that your communication link is secure. You also need to make sure that your hardware is secure and also fault tolerant, because by attacking the hardware, it can also make a database unavailable to users. And also you need to make the physical building secure in case of natural disasters such as earthquake, hurricane. But as you can see, when you look at the database security, you really have to look at the whole picture instead of just focusing on the database. So what are some of the threats to data security? There may be accidental losses attributed to human error, software failure, and hardware failure. How do you deal with this type of threat to data security? Well, for example, you need to make sure that you constantly upgrade the software and the hardware to make sure that you apply the patches to your software in a timely manner. So this way you can avoid a lot of the software failure and hardware failure. You also need to increase the awareness of data security among your employees so that you can reduce the number of human errors. Setting the policies and that will reward good behavior, that will also help to reduce the human errors. The second threat to data security would be theft and fraud. Usually that's conducted by a hacker or somebody who is unhappy with the company or somebody who can benefit from getting confidential information from the company. In order to deal with this, you have to make sure that you have good security policies and good security countermeasures. Improper data access. It's another threat. That can be a threat to the personal data, which is the loss of privacy for your customers, or it can be a threat to the corporate data, which is the loss of confidentiality of your corporate information. A loss of data integrity is also another threat. That means the data becomes inconsistent in your database, making the database corrupted or invalid. Loss of availability, that's another threat to data security. And that can be done through things like a denial of service attack, viruses. All of these can make a database unavailable. Let's talk about these security features. The first one is views. As we talked about in a previous lecture, a view is basically a subset of the database that's presented to one or more users or one or more applications. The view will help us ensure the data security because a view allows us to present only the data that users need to use. The user will not be able to access the data he or she does not use for his or her job. By giving data access through views, the users have no idea what the base table is called, right, and what the base table structure is. That also prevents users from intentionally or unintentionally corrupt the database. And the second feature in the DBMS is the integrity control. Integrity control refers to ensuring things like referential integrity, ensuring data is accurate and within the domain. So those are also built into the DBMS. And they are used to protect data from unauthorized uses and making sure that the data is valid. For example, in SQL, when you create a table, you can use a command called check. And this command can define the allowable values for this particular field. For example, you can say check value between 0.05 and 0.95. That will ensure that only values between 0.05 and 0.95 can be entered into this field. And sometimes we also use triggers to ensure the integrity of the database. We can write a trigger to check to see if the input or an update or the deletion is valid or not. The authorization rules are used to control access to the database, to the objects in the database. You can assign certain authorization to certain users. So for example, one user can only view the data but cannot update the data or delete the data. Another user will be able to access certain fields in the database table, but not all fields in the database table. So those are examples of the authorization rule. So it will restrict the access to data and also restrict the actions that people can take on the data.